You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today, on the 28th edition of the Useless Information Retrocast, you'll hear about a stowaway who opted to remove the body from a coffin and then hide inside. Or how about a man who claimed ownership to a jar containing 2 severed fingers even though he still had all of his own? Plus, you'll learn about an Albuquerque man who was stuck paying for his own funeral even though he was very much alive and the mortuary buried a porcupine instead. You simply can't make this stuff up. Well, all those true stories, the question of the day, today's retro sponsor, and so much more. They're all coming up next on today's edition of the Useless Information Retrocast. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
Hey everyone, today I've chosen to share with you what I believe are some fantastic, totally true stories. So without further ado, let's dive right in. You may recall that about a year ago I told the story of Johann Beck. He was the man who got into a crate and then shipped himself to the United States back in 1901. That story, which I called Box for a Better Life, was episode number 203. If you haven't heard it, I do suggest you go back and listen to it. It's just a small story, but a really interesting one. Anyways, while researching that story that I stumbled upon this one, it was on the same page of one of the newspaper articles. But in this case, we have a man named William Johnson who arrived in New York on Tuesday, October 21st, 1902, aboard the steamship Oscar II, which had come from Copenhagen. Now, just another episode reference. If the Oscar II seems familiar to you, that's because it's the same ship that Henry Ford chartered in 1915 to function as his peace ship. And I told that story in podcast number 172 in May of 2022. Anyway, back to the story. Johnson, who's a Swede, along with 2 young Norwegians, that's Isaac Jensen and Oscar Hansen, they sneaked aboard the Oscar II on the night of October 10th, 1902, just before it sailed from Christiansand. And they managed to go unnoticed for 2 days before being discovered by an officer. When they were brought before Captain Scott, the captain expressed his fury and assigned them to work in the stokehold. Now, if you're not familiar with what a stokehold is, it's basically the place in a steamship in which the stokers fed the boilers with coal. It is not a fun place to be working. Well, there in the stokehold, the 3 heard grim tales about the fate that awaited stowaways in New York. You know, execution by hanging, followed by dismemberment, and then being shipped back to your home country in pieces. Okay, so maybe they're just trying to scare them, but anyway, the thought horrified Johnson, and he spent the next few days thinking of a way to escape this grim destiny. Well, his chance finally came on October 18th of 1902. That's when Hilmar Lundgren, a steerage passenger, died of apoplexy. As a result, Lundgren's body was sealed into a pine coffin with the intention of taking it ashore once they got to New York. But Johnson, he saw an opportunity, and under cover of night, he went to the hold where the body was stored. He pried open the coffin, removed the corpse, and then he hid it under some matting. And you know what's coming next. Johnson then climbed into the coffin, carefully replacing the lid so the nails slid right back into the original holes, but he left it open just enough so he could get some air. The next morning, when the crew realized that Johnson was missing, a search began. Later that afternoon, they found Lundgren's body and assumed that it was Johnson and that he had suffocated under the pile of matting. So they brought the body to the deck, where a steerage passenger recognized it not as Johnson, but as Lundgren. So they rushed back to the coffin, and the crew removed the lid, and inside they found, you know who, Johnson, and he was terrified and nearly starved. And when the ship finally arrived in New York, Johnson and his companions were taken to Ellis Island for deportation. They were placed in the pen reserved for deportees, and they were guarded by immigration officials, of course, to prevent escapes. However, during a routine check that Thursday evening, the guards discovered that Johnson, Hansen, and Jensen, they had disappeared. The guard who was at the top of the stairway leading to the New York pen said that he saw the 3 men head down to another area, but since no one stopped them, he assumed they had been officially released. So what happened to the three men? Well, no one really knows. It's believed that the men just blended in with the other immigrants and then they boarded the ferry boat that transported them to the barge office in New York. And after that, well, they just disappeared into the millions of people already living in the city. Now, the following story appeared on page 1 of the January 20th, 1951 edition of the El Paso Times. And I stumbled across it while researching my story on Billy Cook. That was podcast number 148, which I released back in April of 2021. Just briefly, Cook had killed a family of 5 and a couple of others while he was on the run, and he was the inspiration for the second verse of that famous Doors song, Riders on the Storm. You know, there's a killer on the road, his brain is squirming like a toad, and so on. Well, this story has nothing to do with that. It just happened to be on the same page as one of those articles. Here we go. A curious passerby made an unusual discovery on Friday, January 19th, 1951, when a cactus was found buried beneath the concrete of North Mesa Avenue in El Paso, Texas. Get this, it was believed that the cactus had been buried for over 45 years. The cactus, a southwestern yucca or Spanish dagger, was uncovered by workmen excavating a trench for a water line at the intersection of Main Street. As pneumatic drills cut through roots and scattered plant remnants across the trench floor, longtime El Paso resident and antique shop owner C.E. Croson watched with growing interest. Intrigued by the sight of the cactus roots, Croson asked the crew's foreman, that's Joe Caro, to carefully extract an entire plant. Caro agreed, and after Croson washed off the dirt, he discovered that the cactus was still green with live roots intact. Excited by the find, Croson invited local florist Walter O'Shaney to join him, and another cactus was dug up for him as well. Their next step was to immediately soak the roots in some water and then plant them in damp soil, with the hope of reviving them. Croson, who had lived in El Paso for 46 years, was thrilled by the discovery, and he shared his excitement with local cactus expert John H. Leisure, and Leisure confirmed that the yucca could have survived as long as its roots had access to moisture. In fact, Leisure recalled keeping a cactus alive without water for 4 years. As you can imagine, in his 47 years with the water department, Caro said his crew had never encountered anything like the buried cactus, though of course many odd objects had surfaced during past digs. If you're curious, the concrete where the cactus was found had once been the original surface of Mesa Avenue, but then they later covered that with dirt and repaved over the top of it. Men working about a block away had uncovered ties from tracks that were used for mule cars in the early 1900s. Now, if you're curious, I did check to see if the cacti survived, and there was no follow-up story, so I really don't know. On Friday, May 18th of 1990, the news broke that 2 severed fingers had finally been returned to their owner after spending 23 years in a jar. However, another resident of Bendigo, Victoria, that's in Australia, disputed the claim. He told police they were rightfully his. Well, the curious case of these 2 digits had captivated Bendigo since the previous Sunday. That's when a young couple brought a jar containing the pickled fingers. They had been preserved in methylated spirits. They brought them to the local police station. They said that they discovered the jar while cleaning out their garden shed. Senior Sergeant Graham Aiken explained,
They'd obviously been there for a while, so we ran a piece in the local paper, and the next morning this bloke comes in and says they're his.
Well, that bloke was Michael Ellis, and he maintained that the fingers were rightfully his. But the only problem with his claim was that all of his fingers were fully intact. So Ellis explained that the man had lost his middle and fourth fingers in an accident at the garage where he worked 23 years earlier. He said that the fingers had been sheared off while that man sat in the back of a tow truck. Then, after the injured man was taken to the hospital, Ellis, who was 14 years old at the time, he decided to retrieve the severed fingers. Initially, Ellis kept the fingers in a matchbox, and he'd later use them as a prank to scare women in bars. Nice guy, huh? Anyway, one day the finger's rightful owner confronted him and demanded their return. So what did Ellis do? He denied that he had them. But he did later stash the fingers into a jar. He then sealed it up and hid the jar away. The story then took another twist about a decade before they were found in that garden shed. That's when someone stole the jar from Ellis. As to how it ended up in that couple's shed, well, really no one knows. Unfortunately, over all those many years, the alcohol had mostly evaporated, and that caused the fingers to mummify. They had turned a light chocolate color and looked more like pieces of wood. The only telltale sign that they were fingers were, of course, the fingernails at the tips. But Ellis, he wanted those fingers back. Sergeant Aiken again.
He said he wanted them now because of their sentimental value. We refused, but he said he was going to contact the tractor driver and ask his permission to keep them.
Well, any claim that Ellis had to those severed digits, they vaporized when 52-year-old farmer Giles Carey, he walked into that police station that Friday morning and took possession of the jar. He said,
"But there's no doubt they're mine. You can see where they've come from. The tear matches up with the stumps."
Well, there's no arguing with that, so Giles took the jar containing his fingers home, and he found the perfect place for them. He put them on top of his china cabinet. Sergeant Aiken added,
"It's been a bit of a laugh, but it's nice to have a happy ending."
Chances are that if you own a garage, whether it's attached to your house or not, you have an electric garage door opener attached to it. You hit a button on the remote and the door just magically starts going up. And hopefully, just hopefully, yours is a lot quieter than our noisy beasts. So here's my question for you. In what year was the electric garage door opener invented? Now, you probably don't know the exact date, so if you can get within 5 years of the actual date, you can consider yourself correct. Well, hang around for a bit and I'll tell you the answer at this podcast's end.
Do your family shopping at Kresge's, at Kresge's, at Kresge's. Your dollar buys more at family store. See Kresge's right away. So do come in today.
Of course, Kresge's, the store for you. Kresge's, where you get all the things your family wants at prices your budget approves. And you'll appreciate the complete luncheon service every time you visit your Kresge's store at 4th and Pierce in Sioux City.
Family shopping at Kresge's, at Kresge's, at Kresge's. Your dollar buys more at the family store. See Kresge's right away. So do come in today.
That 1950s commercial of a Kresge's is taken from a collection of radio jingles produced by Allied radio artists. And nearly all of their 45-second ads follow the same format, and that included this one. There were 15 seconds of singing, followed by 15 seconds of music, and then finally 15 more seconds of the jingle. It was over that 15-second interlude that the announcer would speak a message customized to the local market, in this case, Sioux City. I decided to include this recording because of the recent news that the last full-size Kresge's in the continental United States was closing its doors. Now, you may not be familiar with the name Kresge's because it's better known today by its modern name. That's Kmart. And the last big store is located in Bridgehampton, New York, and it's scheduled to close on October 20th. But fear not, there's still one more Kmart left in the entire continental United States. It's a small store that's located in the Kendall Lakes Plaza in Miami. It was once a full-size Kmart, but now it only occupies a small section of what used to be its garden department. If you're curious, the bulk of the old store, where they used to do most of the selling, it's now occupied by an at-home home goods store. So let me give you a little background. Sebastian Kresge opened his first store with partner John McCrory in 1897. That store was located in Memphis, Tennessee, and modeled after the Woolworth 5 and dime stores, and then they opened a second store in Detroit the following year. But after 2 years in business, the two decided to part ways. That deal left McCrory with the Memphis store and Kresge with the Detroit one. But don't feel too sorry for McCrory. That's because his chain operated 1,300 stores at its peak in 1989. They did ultimately go bankrupt and ceased operation in February 2002, but of course McCrory was long deceased by that point. And Kresge's would also grow rapidly. The company had approximately 600 stores just prior to the 1929 stock market crash. Of course, they did see sales fall during the Great Depression, but they quickly recovered once the Second World War was over. But the country's population was also moving out of the cities to the suburbs, and there was a need for larger stores with giant parking lots. In response, the company opened the first Kmart on January 25th of 1962 in San Fernando, California. And for a little reference here, that was just 6 months before the first Walmart opened. Company founder Kresge lived just long enough to see the company that he founded begin its transformation into Kmart. He was 99 years old when he died on October 18th of 1966. And the company continued to grow until the 1980s, but then its fortunes took a downturn. You see, Kmart failed to update its stores, and they faced stiff competition from more agile retailers like Walmart and Target. Meanwhile, corporate management shifted its attention to the company's other specialty stores, and that included Sports Authority, Builders Square, and Walden Books. And that all led Kmart into bankruptcy in 2002. But not long after reorganizing, Kmart announced its plans to purchase Sears. That deal closed on March 24th of 2005, and a new company, Sears Holdings, was formed. Everything had just went downhill from there. Believe it or not, Sears was once the largest and Kmart the second largest retailer in the United States. That was until Walmart began to overtake them in November of 1990. At their peak, there were 3,500 Sears stores and 2,400 Kmarts. Yet today, there's a total of 9 full-line Sears stores and just that one remaining Kmart in all the continental United States. Hard to believe. I have wondered why Transformco, that's the company that currently owns Sears and Kmart, why they continue to operate these stores. You know, they clearly have few customers and don't do much business, so why do they keep them open? Now, I could be totally wrong, but my guess is that since they already own the buildings, it's cheaper to use those as shipping warehouses for online orders rather than renting warehouse space elsewhere. And of course, once they find higher paying tenants for those locations, my hunch is they'll close those remaining stores. And just one final note on Kmart, there may only be one left in the continental US, but there are 5 Kmarts in total in operation. There are 3 more in the US Virgin Islands and 1 in Guam. Next up for your listening pleasure are 5 footnotes to history, which I'm going to read word for word as they were originally printed. And this first one's from the December 11th, 1936 edition of the Times Record News on page 6. The headline reads, Greek alphabet gives scholars' children names. Temple, Texas, December 10th, Associated Press. The late T.J. Lockhart, ministerial student at the Southwestern University 54 years ago, named his daughter Alpha, the first letter of the Greek alphabet. The harmonious sound of Greek was pleasanter to him than the familiar identities like Mary, Margaret, or Nancy, and his second daughter, now Mrs. E.B. Day of Temple, was christened Beta Gamma. Then came Delta Epsilon, Theta Iota, and Zeta Eta, sons who died, Omicron Pi and Upsilon Phi of Austin, Rho Sigma, a daughter deceased, and Lube of Waco. One son not named a Greek letter received a family name. And just a little side note, I think that's Lube, Lou B, because a brother-in-law, Louis B. Hightower, had died in 1918. Upsilon Phi, the youngest son, changed his name to Euphy Lockhart. And if you really think about it, that's U as in Upsilon, and Phi or Phi as in the second part of his name. So Euphy Lockhart. And I did check, and that is the name on his tombstone, Euphy Lockhart. The present Lockhart generation carried the Greek letter idea to one child. Rho Sigma James, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. W. M. James of Port Arthur, was named by her mother Alpha after the first Rho Sigma. That's the one who was deceased. Now, I did do some checking on Ancestry, and the names don't exactly agree. There's a couple of extras, a couple missing. For example, there was Lambda Mu, who was born in 1898 and also died in 1898. So I'm assuming either stillborn or died very shortly after birth. What I find interesting about all these names, and I should mention in my 30 years of teaching, I never had anyone with any of these names. but none of these indicate sex. You don't know if anyone is a male or a female. I mean, we do know Alpha was a female and Upsilon Phi was a male, but the names themselves do not give that away. So there you go. If anyone's in need of a non-binary baby name, just start with the Greek alphabet. This next story appeared on the front page of the Modesto Bee on October 22nd of 1956. Woman, 82, accidentally locked in own bathroom for 8 days, tells of hunger torture. By George W. Cornell, New York, Associated Press. In 8 days without a bite to eat, you begin to think about the end, especially when you're 82. For 8 harrowing days and nights, Mrs. Henrietta A. Emhart was an accidental prisoner in her own apartment in the heart of the city.
I thought I was going to have to die there, that I'd gradually starve to death.
There was not even space to lie down.
It was torture.
Mrs. Emhart said today, her ordeal over. A week ago Friday, Mrs. Emhart became locked in the bathroom of her apartment at 11 East 92nd Street, where she lives alone. She had fallen against the door, jamming it tightly, and then, in trying to open it, had pulled the handle off the doorknob. The rod slipped out on the other side. She was trapped. She shouted until her voice gave out, pounded until her fists went raw, and beat with a brush on the water pipes until she was so weak she couldn't lift her arms.
For the first 4 or 5 days, oh, how I pounded on the door all day and night with all my might, hoping and praying that someone would help. Over the water pipes, I could hear the sound of people all over the house, and I couldn't understand how they could be so heartless as to not come. There was no place to stretch out for a tall person like me. When I tried to lie down, my whole body would go into cramps.
She would hear a telephone ring, but it was beyond her prison door. Unknown to her in Darien, Connecticut, a cousin, J.F. Schulten, had been phoning repeatedly. Worried, he finally asked the police to check on her. Saturday night, the police knocked down the bathroom door. Today, rested and still eating ravenously, Mrs. Emhart said,
My legs still are very weak, and it'll take time to get my strength back, but otherwise, I feel wonderful.
Next up, we have a story from June 18th, 1960. This is from the Akron Beacon Journal and appeared on the front page. The headline on this one is Stuck with Cost of Own Funeral. Albuquerque, New Mexico, Associated Press. The case of the porcupine's funeral has ended. District Judge Robert Reedy has ruled that an Albuquerque mortuary can collect $2,055.50 for the burial of the charred remains of the porcupine, purported to be those of Manuel N. Armejo Jr. of Albuquerque. Now, $2,055.50 would be about $21,500 today. Eloy Vigil, an embalmer for Garcia Mortuary, which brought the suit against Armejo and his wife Priscilla, testified that the remains of the porcupine, along with an ancient Indian skull and some calf bones, were buried with the belief that they were Armejo's. Armejo testified he was in an automobile wreck in western New Mexico, that his car burned, and he was dazed and didn't come to until several days later at a mountain logging camp. By that time, a coroner's inquest had been held and the porcupine brought to Albuquerque and buried as Armejo. I have to say, I just can't help but wonder, how could anyone mistake a porcupine for a human body? Next up, we have a story from the October 13th, 1977 publication of the Daily Telegraph in London. This appeared on page 19. Blindfolded driver hit police van, by our crime correspondent. Ronald Markham, 51, Romark the illusionist and hypnotist, was reported yesterday by police for allegedly driving dangerously and without due care while demonstrating how to drive a car blindfolded. P.C. William Coates was driving a van along Cranbrook Road, Ilford, when he saw a crowd causing an obstruction. Then Inspector Gareth Jones arrived and went to speak to the driver of a Park Renault who was blindfolded. Before he could reach the car, it drove off a few yards, ran into the back of P.C. Coates' van, and stopped. Now, I can't speak for anyone else, but I prefer to see where I'm going when I'm driving. Hopefully you agree. And our last little tidbit for today is from July 27th, 1979. This appeared in the Vancouver Sun on page 2. The headline on this one is, Flasher Gets Fresh Coat. A man with amorous intentions was given the brush off by a female painter Thursday afternoon. Police say the man who was intoxicated allegedly exposed himself to Langara student Carol Carl outside the Main Hotel, 645 Main at 2:50 p.m. Wednesday, while she was painting the outside of the building. Carl, 38, not pleased with the advances of the man, took her paint roller and painted him bright orange. The man fled but was picked up by police who had little problem in spotting the bright orange paint. Carl said today the man walked up to her, pulled his drawers down, grabbed her by the leg, and started to laugh. So she grabbed her paint roller and painted him.
From his business to the top of his bald head, it was so neatly done on top of his Lee Trevino shirt.
She said that she used marine enamel paint.
It's very hard to get off. When you're only 5 feet tall, you have to defend yourself the best you can.
The man was held for 3 hours until he sobered up and then released. So earlier in the podcast, I'd asked you to guesstimate the year in which the electric garage door opener was invented. And before I reveal the answer, let's start with garage doors in general. Well, back in the days of horse and buggies, the standard garage door was the old side hinge barn door style. And they were great, but they really weren't very well suited for the automobile. So by the 1920s, it was clear that a new type of garage door was needed. One that was faster, easier, and of better design. And that's where Owen L. Daughtry, an experienced woodworker and shop foreman, enters the picture. In 1919, he filed for a patent on an upward-moving, quote, rollable or flexible, unquote, garage door. And his patent was granted in 1922. But the problem was that Daughtry wasn't a salesman, so in 1921 he joined up with salesman Clarence Gilbert Johnson, or C.G. Johnson for short, and they formed the Daughtry Johnson Manufacturing Company to make those doors. Well, their timing couldn't have been better. That's because the 1920s saw a boom in new car sales, and that of course led to a growing demand for garages. Well, sales of their innovative garage door design just soared, and by 1923 the company had rebranded as the Overhead Door Company, and they continue to operate under that name today. As for the electric garage door opener itself, Henry Cady Blodgett filed his patent application in February of 1926. So that's the answer to the question. The electric garage door opener was invented in 1926. Did you get it right? His patent was issued on July 17th of 1928 and was assigned to the Overhead Door Company. And you know what that means. The company now had the patent for the modern garage door design, and they also had the patent for the machine that could open them. Not a bad position to be in. But if you do some searching, you'll see that many sources claim that C.G. Johnson invented both the overhead garage door and the electric garage door opener. But clearly that's not backed by the evidence. And while his name was listed as the inventor on 21 different U.S. patents, he's not mentioned on either of those two inventions. So it's probably best to think of Johnson as having been the one who had both the sales skills and the vision to turn those ideas into products that every homeowner wanted. Kind of like what Steve Jobs did. And as I had mentioned, Overhead Door is still a big-time manufacturer of garage doors today, although it is now a subsidiary of the Japanese company Sanwa Holdings. Plus, they do still make electric garage door openers, and they sell them under the Genie name, and you may be familiar with that. They acquired the Genie company in 1994. Well, I do hope you enjoyed hearing all those stories. My personal favorite was the man being forced to pay for the burial of the porcupine. How could I just can't help but wonder how no one noticed. I did also like the quick thinking of the woman who painted the man who flashed her, although I will admit that I thought there should have been a harsher penalty for what he did. Now, I haven't asked this in a while, but if you can go to your favorite podcast app, whether that's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever, it would be great if you could leave a positive review of this podcast. In fact, any noise you can make out there in cyberspace to help me grow my audience, I have to tell you, it's greatly, greatly appreciated, and I do thank you in advance. Just a reminder that the Useless Information Podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network, so be sure to visit airwavemedia.com, and there you'll find a curated selection of some of the best podcasts out there. Well, I'll be back shortly with a full-length story, and in the meantime, thanks for listening, and take care, everyone. Bye.